Hello, welcome to today's Fun Friday. I'm Alix.
I'm Kelly.
And this is the LitJoy Podcast. Hello, reader. Welcome to part 2 of this Fun Friday. This is a Fun Friday nonfiction, not self-help Fun Friday.
I love that title.
I know, it's fantastic. So these are books that are not specifically self-help books, but they are also nonfiction that just had an impact in our life. And we recommend often to readers to pick them up and non-readers just to pick them up.
And in true Kelly and Alix fashion, we don't know how to keep it concise to 10 minutes.
Nope.
So we decided to do a part 2.
Yep. Part 1 had the first 5. Part 2 has our next 5. So up first, Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know.
Ooh.
This is by Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah.
And Malcolm Gladwell is an interesting author. Sometimes people feel like he draws conclusions out of too much qualitative data and not enough quantitative, or other criticisms are that he's a bit reductionistic. However, the thing that I do love about Malcolm Gladwell's books is that they are conversation starters and they open up potential possibilities for why things are the way they are. And yeah,
he just makes you think different, right?
He does. And he writes like a journalist because he is.
Yeah.
So it's just engaging the entire time.
Have you read a lot of his stuff?
I've read 3 or 4 of his. This one's my favorite. This one is, I'll read the synopsis because each of these was so fantastic. How did Fidel Castro fool the CIA for a generation? Why did Neville Chamberlain think he could trust Adolf Hitler? Why are campus sexual assaults on the rise? Do television sitcoms teach us something about the way we relate to each other that isn't true? Et cetera, et cetera. So he presents all of these scenarios where throughout history, someone has been very gullible or has believed something that was totally false or has created a false story. So it's these lies that we tell ourselves. So some of the really interesting ones that I think about this book at least once a week.
Oh gosh.
So there's some that are fascinating. First of all, one of my favorite ones was The Queen of Cuba.
Oh.
That was fascinating. Was it The Queen of Cuba or so there's a female spy.
Whoa.
That has infiltrated the U.S. government from Cuba. And that is so interesting to learn about her and her story. There's also that one woman who was arrested in Italy and she's an American, and she was basically the police in Italy created this entire dramatic, false, and weirdly sexual story around why she committed this double murder.
Oh, geez.
She didn't.
Yeah.
She was completely innocent.
Wow.
And it's just there's moments where people make the wrong snap judgment about people.
Gotcha.
And and the guy who had that Ponzi scheme that just he stole hundreds of millions of dollars from people, and he was just robbing Peter to feed Paul, that kind of a thing.
Like Wolf of Wall Street kind of stitch?
Yes, very much so. And it's fascinating.
Yeah.
So this book, I'm conversation starter immediately, made my husband read it, and it was really fun.
I'm going to read this little teeny bit that kind of summarizes what you just said, because I was like, it's a very interesting topic.
Yes.
So it says, Gladwell argues with the tools and strategies we use to make sense of people we don't know. And because we don't know how to talk to strangers, we are inviting conflict and misunderstandings in ways that have a profound effect on our lives in the world. So very much what you're saying, just kind of cinched up where it's talking to strangers is what the book's about. And does he get to a point where you learn how to talk to strangers?
I think the whole point of the book is you need to check yourself in the stories you're telling yourself.
Great.
Where because of these stories, that's where racism happens. It's where sexism, homophobia. It's also where we just assume everybody's out to get us. There are these stories we tell ourselves that we are irreparably different and other and alien from the person in front of us. And it creates opportunities to be, I think, critical of others and also to miss warning signs because of these stories we're telling ourselves.
Absolutely.
So
fascinating.
It's so interesting.
I'm talking about fascinating. Let's talk about number 7 on the list here.
All right. Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe. I think that's how you say it. So this one is all about the Sackler family. Oh, the drama.
Okay, so for people who don't know anything about this family, what's like the quick...
Oh, the Sackler family is responsible for the opioid epidemic of the U.S.
Just like in the U.S., yeah.
So they have, they are incredibly wealthy.
Yes.
And they essentially created a drug, oxycodone, the opioid derivative drug that is highly addictive pain drug. And this was so fascinating to read because it breaks down the entire corrupt relationship between them and the FDA, between them and doctors. The Sackler family and kind of their company as a whole incentivized doctors to prescribe and overdose on these meds and so people were
line their pockets.
Yes. And people were just they were taking their prescribed dose of medication and still overdosing because of how potent this drug is. And then of course, millions and millions were addicted to the point of overdose. And so they are responsible for the deaths of many people. And so this Empire of Pain is fun because it just like lays out all the dirt. And I actually read this and then I read this right before I went to New York.
Yeah.
And that was right after they took down the Sackler wing. So if you notice in the Met, there is a wing where it has this beautiful Egyptian temple that's been reconstructed indoors. And that used to be the Sackler wing where they had donated the funds to create that. They also, though, the Sacklers did not like ride under the radar. They like put their name on a bunch of different donations to universities and
it says that their name adorned the walls of many storied institutions like Harvard.
Yes.
Okay. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, which you were just talking about. Oxford and the Louvre. So they're not trying to hide. It just shows how powerful they are.
There's some serious ego here.
Yeah.
And just also how they tried to claim bankruptcy and like stashed all their money away because there was legal repercussions. And what's fun though is it does go through the court system. It goes through the entire trial.
The trial.
Which was really interesting too, to kind of see how like a few good people won here.
Okay.
So.
Fascinating reads.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on to number 8 on our list, which is Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. So anything that I feel like Walter Isaacson writes, he does such an incredible job. Like he always deep dives so intensely on whoever he is learning about and interviewing. So it was a really, really fascinating read. I mean, Steve Jobs is, of course, revolutionary in the tech movement that occurred, in the late 90s. And he's just a very interesting person in general, right?
Very sensational personality.
Yes. And so with this one, you get to learn all about Steve Jobs. You learn about from like the very beginning of his life and how he got into wanting to do something with computers before they existed. It's all talking about starting in the garage, literally, and how he brought on different partners and how they wanted to make such a difference in the world. And then you get fast forward all the way to where he basically got kicked out of Apple.
Yep.
There's so many things to talk about in this book. It was a very fascinating read. And he doesn't like skim over the fact that Steve was a very incredibly hard person to be around.
Yeah.
And to work for. It had to be really, you had to hold on to yourself, I think, if you worked with Steve, because he is that personality that is going to challenge you. He's not going to walk around anything.
Yeah.
He'll call you out immediately. And he wanted there to be open dialogue at all times with his employees.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting workplace because some people found it to be contentious or almost intense, because if you're going to work around Steve, he's not going to pussyfoot around anything.
Yeah.
It is very much, I want to know exactly what you're thinking, when you're thinking it. Say it to me, say it to my face. Like, I need you to be brave. It's kind of if you work with Steve. So it was a beautifully written book, but also gave you a real insight into who Steve Jobs was.
Yeah.
And you don't love him as a person in some ways, but you absolutely appreciate the contributions that he's made, right?
Yeah.
Completely changed, like, the fact that we all have iPhones and
he changed the game with phones and computers.
Yeah,
for
and
sure.
just even marketing, right?
Yes.
So it just gives you that full picture of Steve Jobs and what he's accomplished, what his mark and legacy was, and who he was as a person. So highly recommend. It was fascinating to read. My husband and I both talked about it for like hours after we finished.
Nice.
So,
perfect. On to number 9. Educated by Tara Westover. We've chatted about this one a few times because it's a little bit close to home for us. Tara Westover was essentially raised in a fundamentalist Christian family. I would say they were fundamentalist Mormons, is probably how they would describe themselves. So they did home education and no access to doctors. Very interesting because they're in southern Idaho, which is kind of close to home. And the first time she ever stepped into a classroom was when she went to college when she was 17. And she didn't realize how sheltered and also unprotected she was as a child.
All she knew is what her parents taught her.
Very, very isolated.
They were very isolated in, I think they worked in almost like a junkyard and didn't have a lot of interactions with other humans, honestly. And so everything she knew came from her parents and a couple of her siblings, but that's it. And so as she started to realize there's so much more in the world and got out there, like you mentioned, she went to BYU, Brigham Young University at 17, and she's sitting in these classes learning about things that she's never heard of. So it was so
like the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Or like world wars, or just like other religions existed, or very, very cult-like upbringing, where there's a strict narrative on what is true and what isn't. And just so interesting to read about the unfolding of like her realizing who she is and what was truth and what was lies, and kind of reclaiming her education about who she is. So
I'm like, how brave. So brave. Gosh. She just jumped right into a college like BYU and felt and was so naive and uneducated at that point. And so she was like, no, this is my mission. I want to get educated. And that's the book. And it really is uplifting. There's a few parts that are just like crazy to read about, when
they're difficult to digest, but But
it really was an uplifting book, I felt like, for the most part, in seeing her full arc, because now she's literally a professor. She's just completely gone to the opposite end.
And for number 10, The Boys in the Boat, 9 Americans and Their Epic Quest for Gold at the 1936 Berlin Olympics by Daniel James Brown. Succinct title. I have like so many nonfictions have the longest titles.
They do.
But it's okay.
They're like, we're going to tell you what our whole book's about in this long sentence.
I was like, I read it. That's the whole book. I'm done. Okay, so here's the thing. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were an incredibly important Olympics game because, first of all, the world didn't really fully know what was happening with the Holocaust. They kind of knew that we were on the verge of World War II, and the Germany was bolstering itself for something, and it was incredibly politically tense. But the atrocities of the Holocaust were not physically apparent because they weren't happening in Berlin, and Hitler had staged Berlin to be just this perfect reception for the world to come, and he had the expectation that Germany would win all the gold medals, or as many as possible. There was so much pressure on the athletes of the world to show a strong force against Germany, and the Germans to show a strong force against the world. And so very much this Axis and Allies thing happening, but with athletes. And what's so wonderful about The Boys in the Boat is they were just 9 boys they weren't even professional athletes. They were like collegiate, and they were just 9 boys from Washington. And a lot of them had gotten done with World War I, or it was just an interesting time. They were growing up in the shadow of World War I. And honestly, it just made me so proud because I'm from the Puget Sound, and the weather there fucking sucks.
It's the worst.
It's the worst. And so these boys just get up and they get on these, these long boats, these crew boats, and they're relentless in their physical perseverance.
It's a really beautiful read because you do get some individual stories, but there's one in particular that they kind of focus on who, this boy who's grown up in a really tough circumstance. So you really hear a lot from his side. But
yes.
it's such an interesting sport because it's not about the individual at all.
Not at all.
It has to be about everybody in succinct motion.
Yes.
It's a totally different approach to something with teamwork involved, right? And I'm going to read this quote in a second about it, but it was such an uplifting, motivating read. I think we read this for our book club as well, and everyone was very hyped and jazzed about it. But so the quote says, "It was when he tried to talk about the boat that his words began to falter and tears welled up in his eyes. Finally, watching Joe struggle for composure over and over, I realized that the boat was something more than just the shell or its crew. To Joe, it encompassed but transcended both. It was something mysterious and almost beyond definition. It was a shared experience, a singular thing that had unfolded in a golden sliver of time long ago when 9 good-hearted young men strove together. Together, they pulled as one, gave everything they had for one another, bound together forever by pride and respect and love. Joe was crying, at least in part for the loss of that vanished moment, but much more, I think, for the sheer beauty of it." So Joe's the one we were talking about that you hear a lot about his story. And when he talks about the boat, he talked about how he would just get so emotional and his eyes would well up because of everything it meant. Because even the boats, they talk to the shell of the boat. There was somebody who would hand make every one of these boats. And you get to learn about him too and how important it is. And so very interesting, fascinating, heartwarming read that we definitely remembered.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you for listening.
There's our top 10.
Done. Thank you for listening to this fun Friday. Please remember to rate and review us.
And like a good book, recommend us to your friends.